Welcome back. For our top domestic story this hour, we take a look at what some are calling a new McCarthyism, anti-China fervor in the United States. As you know, a main component of the Trump presidency has been his all-out trade war with China. And on Monday, the president told the Wall Street Journal that it's, quote, highly unlikely he will heed Beijing's call to halt a rise in tariffs targeting Chinese goods. He told the Journal, quote, if we don't make a deal, then I'm going to put the additional $267 billion on, threatening a 10 to 25% increase on additional Chinese imports. The levies could impact goods such as laptops and iPhones. Trump's intimidation tactics were deployed just days ahead of the 13th G20 summit, which is scheduled to begin in Buenos Aires on November 30th. The president is expected to meet with his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, during the event. Earlier this month, Vice President Mike Pence described the conversation he expects the two leaders to have.
The relationship between the United States and America and China goes back much farther than that, but there are differences today. They begin with trade practices, with tariffs and quotas and forced technology transfers, the theft of intellectual property, but it goes beyond that to freedom of navigation in the seas and concerns about human rights. All of those issues I know are going to be topics that the president and President Xi discuss at the G20.
You heard the vice president reference, quote, forced technology transfers, which makes it sound as though China is stealing U.S. technology. In reality, China and the United States have signed the 1979 Agreement on Cooperation in Science and Technology, which created joint science ventures and mutually beneficial and voluntary transfers of technology, hardware, software, as well as research data, resources, and equipment. Speaking recently during the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting earlier in November, Xi had this to say about his beliefs for the future of the global economy.
China will protect the legal interests of overseas funded enterprises, firmly punish the behaviors that infringe on the legal interests, especially the intellectual property. We will enhance the quality and efficiency of protection for intellectual property by bringing in a punitive compensation system which will increase the cost of offenses. Improving the business environment is a long-going process. Countries should attempt to improve their own business environment, solve their own problems. They shouldn't just point fingers at the others but ignore their own faults. They shouldn't be the torchlight doing nothing but exposing the weaknesses of others but not seeing their own.
With China-U.S. relations in question, we're joined now by Dr. Gerald Horne, a professor of history at the University of Houston. He recently spoke about the new McCarthyism in targeting China-invested firms. That was during an interview with the Black Agenda Report. Thanks so much for making time for us this afternoon, Dr. Horne. I wanted to start by asking you about how confident you are that the Democratic Party and its wing of the corporate media will oppose Trump as he escalates with China, because they're usually very enthusiastic to stand against any of the president's initiatives.
Yes, but keep in mind that the two major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, even though they may diverge on domestic questions, generally speaking, are united on foreign policy matters. There's this adage that politics stops at the water's edge. That is to say, there's a mania for bipartisanship. Recall that both parties supported the Cold War. Both parties, generally speaking, supported the disastrous and perhaps illegal war in Vietnam. And so it should not be found surprising that there is a tendency for both parties to stand united against China. Indeed, Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who is one of the more left-leaning members of the Democratic Party and already is being touted as a potential presidential nominee in 2020, has a line with regard to China that's quite similar to the line of Donald J. Trump. So don't hold your breath for the corporate media to begin to raise these sorts of questions and contradictions.
In your interview with the Black Agenda Report, you mentioned that White House advisor Peter Navarro accused some Wall Street executives of being unregistered foreign agents of China. Why would he say that, and what's your reaction to the comment?
Well, I think that he is trying to hammer into line all of the corporate titans who are profiting handsomely from deals with China. I'm speaking of Microsoft, Apple, KFC, Starbucks, which basically opens a cafe in China every day. Keep in mind as well that Vice President Michael Pence, in two rather startling speeches on October 4th in Washington and November 17th in Papua New Guinea at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, made also rather fire-breathing statements targeting China. Mr. Navarro's comments were quite in line with those of the vice president, and it appears that the U.S. administration is going to try to compel the shareholders of these U.S. corporations to take a haircut, that is to say, to take losses in order to pursue this anti-China line, just like farmers in the U.S. Midwest, particularly soybean farmers, are taking heavy losses because of this tariff war, this trade war that has been ignited by the U.S. administration in Washington.
Do you think that will be a successful policy, especially considering the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission recently declared that China's technological advancement threatens U.S. national security? I mean, what is it about China the U.S. fears so much, and where can all of this tension lead?
Well, I think that Washington fears that Beijing is in the passing lane. As Washington looks over the horizon, they see China surging ahead with regard to new technologies, particularly quantum computing and green energy and artificial intelligence. Washington feels that it has to intervene aggressively in order to prevent China from surging ahead. Then there's the problem that Washington, for the past century, has spent trillions of taxpayers' dollars supposedly combating communists. That was the rationale for the genocidal war in Southeast Asia. That was the rationale for the disastrous Cold War. And yet, at the end of the day, the 21st century seems to suggest that a country led by a communist party, speaking of China, is surging ahead. This is too much of a paradox for Washington to accept, and so Washington is going to do everything in its power to prevent this reality from emerging.
Well, what would you like American working people to understand about China as they're inundated with media and politicians constantly telling them Beijing's the enemy?
Well, first of all, people in the United States need to understand history. That is to say, 45-odd years ago, President Richard M. Nixon went to Beijing and cut a deal with the Chinese leadership in order to bring the then Soviet Union to heel. The payoff for China was massive direct foreign investment, not only from the United States and its European allies, but also from Japan. This also led China to wage war in Vietnam, I'm afraid, in the late 1970s. In order to understand where China is today, first of all, you have to understand that history and recognize that it was not a stroke of genius that Mr. Nixon went to China and negotiated that deal. It was actually the beginning of the end for U.S. imperialism.
And we'll have to leave it there for now. Professor Gerald Horne, we really appreciate you making time for us and breaking all of that down today.
Thank you.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.